None of this makes any sense. If Canadian news actually did its job and told Canadians the news instead of putting a spin on absolutely everything, then they wouldn't be in this mess.
Yeah, and maybe Canadians would actually, I don't know, what's the term, watch them.
As predicted in our previous coverage, the streaming giants have responded to Bill C11 with a vengeance. And who are the people that will end up footing the $200 million bill? You guessed it, all of us.
Let's take a look. Streaming giants launch multiple legal challenges to Bill C11 payments in Canada. So, if you have forgotten, or if somehow you don't know about what Bill C11 is, let us just do a quick recap for you before we get to that. So Bill C11 is the first of a series of bills that the Trudeau government has implemented. And they say it is to make things more fair for Canadian content creators and properly compensate news organizations and that sort of thing. But really what it is it's a result of all of the Canadian giants, which are midgets in the global arena, but the Canadian media giants lobbying the government repeatedly, dozens of times, in order to get some sort of law that gives them money because they can't manage their businesses properly. They can't compete with media organizations outside of Canada, and they also are struggling to compete, especially in the news arena, against independent content creators like Northern Perspective.
Yours truly, that's right.
So this first bill is intended to ensure that the CRTC gets to classify what is actually Canadian content. Spoiler alert, Northern Perspective would not classify as Canadian content.
Unless we wanted to register with the CRTC, which I don't think we have any intention of doing that.
Well, we would have to get a lawyer, and we'd have to pay a lot of money to the CRTC and all of that. So
then we'd be regulated.
Yeah.
No thanks.
So after they decide what's Canadian content, then they would be going to the different streaming services, including YouTube, might I add, and forcing them to prioritize the Canadian content to Canadian viewers. So that would essentially take all of the channels that the CRTC doesn't classify as Canadian content, or let's put it real, all of the channels and shows that the Canadian government doesn't want you to see, and put them at the back of the algorithm, meaning that when we upload a video, you may not even see it.
Now, something similar does exist currently with radio and television broadcasters. So you might say, what's the difference with the internet? Well, the difference with the internet is that you, the viewer, goes to the internet looking for something specific, usually. Maybe you want a story about the Toronto St. Paul's by-election. So you go to YouTube and you type that into the search bar, and lo and behold, a bunch of results show up. With television and radio broadcasting, you're entirely at the mercy of the broadcaster, whether that's the television broadcaster or the DJ. So back in, I think it was the 70s, they implemented a rule that 30% of the media that was shown on a Canadian television station or that was played on a Canadian radio station needed to be Canadian content. And that meant it needed to be by a Canadian artist, by a Canadian producer, by a Canadian script writer, etc.
Which is interesting because there was a story that came out in the last week that the CRTC is no longer classifying Bryan Adams as Canadian content. So isn't that interesting?
That's odd.
But so anyway, so what does this mean? Well, it means that there's also a price tag attached to this to the tune of around $200 million that the streaming giants like Disney and Netflix and Amazon Prime and the rest of them would have to give to Canada. What organizations are those going to? Well, the Canadian news organizations, of course, because they're just going to get handouts from everybody at this point. So this is the chessboard that is being set here, and we had speculated that They're not just going to say, you know what, we'll just give you tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars, just at a charity, because that's the type of, capitalistic media giants that are located outside of Canada in the United States. Yeah, right. We all knew that this was going to be passed down to the consumer at one point, but the media giants to the south of us aren't having it. And they're filing a lawsuit against the Canadian government. So let's take a look.
Foreign streaming platforms, including Netflix, Amazon, and Spotify, have launched federal court challenges to the way Ottawa's Online Streaming Act, which will force them to inject millions of dollars into Canada's broadcast sector, is being implemented by the regulator. The challenges threaten to delay the implementation of the act, which would compel foreign streaming giants to pay about $200 million a year to support Canadian music, TV, film, and radio. The Motion Picture Association Canada, which represents Netflix as well as Hollywood studios such as Paramount, Universal, and Warner Brothers Discovery, this week launched dual legal challenges in federal court to decisions by their Canadian Radio, Television, and Telecommunications Commission, which is implementing the act. The music streaming platforms Amazon, Apple, and Spotify also filed legal challenges in federal court over the CRTC's decision to compel them to make financial contributions in Canada under the Act, also known as Bill C11. The Motion Picture Association Canada argues that the funding mechanism chosen by the CRTC could lead to the disclosure of sensitive, confidential financial information to Canadian broadcasters that its members compete with. It is also concerned that the CRTC would make its members contribute to the Canadian Association of Broadcasters, or CAB, named with the CRTC in the court filings. It alleges this would enable CAB to calculate how much the foreign streamers make from broadcasting in Canada by doing the math on the amount of money studios contribute. The CRTC announced last month that platforms such as Netflix, Spotify, and Amazon Prime will have to contribute 5% of their annual Canadian revenues to support broadcasting in this country. Foreign streaming platforms that are not affiliated with a Canadian broadcaster and make at least $25 million or more of Canadian broadcasting revenue per year will have to do a payout under a regime that follows the passing of Bill C11 last year. The Motion Picture Association Canada has also challenged a CRTC decision to make streaming platforms, including Netflix, contribute to local news in Canada. It says the CRTC has no authority to make them support local news here, and that this was not envisioned when Bill C11 was going through Parliament.
Quote, the CRTC's decision to require global entertainment streaming services to pay for local news is a discriminatory measure that goes far beyond what Parliament intended, exceeds the CRTC's authority, and contradicts the goal of creating a modern, flexible framework that recognizes the nature of the services global streamers provide, end quote, Wendy Noss, president of the MPA Canada, said in a statement to the Globe and Mail on Thursday. Quote, our members' streaming services do not produce local news, nor are they granted the significant legal privileges and protections enjoyed by Canadian broadcasters in exchange for the responsibility to provide local news, end quote. Graham Davies, president and CEO of the Digital Media Association, said 3 of its members, Amazon, Apple, and Spotify, have filed legal challenges in Canada about contributions they would have to make under Bill C11. The music streaming platforms have also raised concerns about having to contribute to a fund supporting local news in Canada. Quote, the contributions must be made to various government-mandated funds, such as local news production for the benefit of commercial radio stations that have been pre-selected by the CRTC, end quote, he said in a statement on Thursday. Quote, the approach taken is backward-looking and bad public policy from the current government of Canada and fails to acknowledge streaming's existing contributions to music production, end quote. The Digital Media Association has warned previously that the act could lead to prices being driven up for consumers. Foreign streaming platforms will have to contribute to a variety of funds, including those supporting the creation of Indigenous content and work by Black filmmakers and other Canadians from diverse backgrounds. The federal court challenges do not involve payments by the movie and TV studios to these funds. The MPA Canada said it is concerned about studios having to pay into a Canadian local news fund administered by the Canadian Association of Broadcasters. It says Bill C11 requires foreign streaming services to contribute to Canadian broadcasting in a fair way appropriate to the nature of the service. This means studios that do not produce local news should not have to support its creation in Canada. Kevin Desjardins, president of the Canadian Association of Broadcasters, said the CAB has historically received, quote, confidential financial information from cable and satellite distributors and dealt with it appropriately and without issue. We have the ability and the integrity to do so going forward, end quote. The MPA Canada's lawsuit demonstrates the foreign streamers', quote, avaricious approach to the Canadian market, end quote, he added. As the foreign global streamers remain focused on sucking billions of Canadian dollars out of the Canadian-owned media system, the CAB remains focused on ensuring that we keep Canadian journalists in Canadian newsrooms, he said. He added the CAB administers funds such as the Independent Local News Fund without fees. Mirabella Salem, a spokesperson for the CRTC, said, quote, the Online Streaming Act, which amended the Broadcasting Act, requires the CRTC to modernize the Canadian broadcasting framework, end quote. Quote, as this particular matter is before the Federal Court of Appeal, it would be inappropriate for the CRTC to comment, end quote. So this is what we warned a lot of people about, and this is what a lot of other content creators have been warning people about, and this is what the news organizations have been warning everybody about, and this is what everybody that went in committee to respond to Bill C11 was warning everybody about. So, the CRTC reveals all, because they didn't really talk a lot about money inside of Bill C11. A lot of that was Bill C18, forcing Facebook and Google to pay the news organizations $200 million in fees. Now, the CRTC is now saying, all right, so all of you, you have to support local news as well. How does it make sense at all that Netflix has to pay into a local news fund?
None of this makes any sense. If Canadian news actually did its job and told Canadians the news instead of putting a spin on absolutely everything, then they wouldn't be in this mess.
Yeah, and maybe Canadians would actually, I don't know, what's the term, watch them.
Well, and so many Canadians are turning to alternate media sources like Northern Perspective to get the news because, again, the mainstream media is just spinning things in favor of the government who is giving them billions of dollars.
Well, and that's the thing, we try and give it to you straight. We give you our opinion, and maybe our opinion is incorrect, but we try and be as straight as possible with our opinion. So what we see here is, again, just a result of lobbying from the Canadian media giants crying, poor little me, poor little me. Well, you didn't say poor little me when you guys had the monopoly on broadcasting, now did you? It was only when the internet came along and you thought it was a fad, you completely ignored it, didn't adjust your business model, and now look what's happened. You're losing business left, right, and center because you don't know what to do.
Well, and we do want to state that the news is important for Canadians, but the way that the news media has been doing it the past, I don't even know how many years, again, they're putting a spin on everything. They're biased. They're trying to paint the government in a light. They're not providing all of the details. They're not getting into the nitty gritty of the details. Canadians want the raw information so that they can make up their own minds. They don't want to be told what to think.
Well, and they want the government they want the news media to hold the government to account, which is kind of part of its job when it comes to a free democracy.
And they've really only been doing that the past 6 months because I think they know the writing's on the wall for Trudeau and the Liberals.
Right. None of them should be getting government funding because it puts them in a conflict of interest. Puts the government in a conflict of interest, and it puts these media outlets in a conflict of interest.
Right, because again, are you going to say something bad about the government that's giving you billions of dollars? Are you going to bite the hand that feeds you? Right,
and you see all these stories that the CBC has completely ignored, really important stories, like ArriveCan, like the SCTC scandal.
Or even stories that, again, we'll watch something on Pearlview and then we'll see a CBC article about it later in the day or even the next day. And we'll be like, did you guys watch the same video that we did? Because we got completely different information out of that.
Right. So now the good news is this lawsuit is threatening to delay the implementation of C11 even further. So right now it doesn't even look like it's going to be quote unquote implemented until 2026. And guess what happens in 2025?
We get another election, if not sooner.
Right.
And the other thing is that this shows the government they can't just do whatever they want and implement whatever bills that they want without a fight. This is not the first lawsuit that they've had to deal with in regards to some sort of new policy or new bill that they've tried to put in place. Look at the single-use plastics.
The good news is that odds are this is never going to come to pass. But if it did, and if it does, these organizations that are going to be paying $200 million to local news, they're not going to be paying $200 million of local news. They're going to be raising their prices, and then we are going to be having to pay $200 million to local news. So, why doesn't you got to wonder, why doesn't the government just like shortcut all this and just say, hey, Canada, we're raising taxes on you by $200 million, and that's going straight to the news organizations. At least that would be honest.